June 4, 1942, 10:30 a.m. The Pacific Ocean lies calm beneath a hard blue sky. A few white clouds drift above the steel horizon, their shadows gliding across endless water. On the decks of 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the air shimmers with heat and noise. Mechanics run between aircraft lined in perfect rows, their hands slick with sweat and oil. Bombs are hoisted, torpedoes armed, fuel lines hissing. The scent of aviation gasoline hangs thick over the sea. From above, it looks serene. From below, it feels like the center of the world. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo believes his force is untouchable. 248 aircraft ready to strike again at the tiny atoll called Midway. But far above, at 19,000 feet, specks appear in the sky. 37 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, circling like hawks, unseen by their prey. Engines hum, altimeters drop, hatches open. In the next 5 minutes, Japan's dream of Pacific domination will begin to die, not in a grand strategy room or in a diplomatic cable, but here, in sunlight and fire, above a calm blue sea. The story of those 5 minutes begins months earlier, in the afterglow of triumph. By early 1942, the Empire of Japan seemed unstoppable. In 6 months, its forces had swept across half of the Pacific, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled America's battleships, leaving the Pacific Fleet reeling. Tokyo's war planners believed they had achieved what had once seemed impossible: the removal of the United States as a threat to Japan's growing Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was both the architect and skeptic of that victory. He knew America's industrial capacity, its population, and its will. Japan had won the first rounds, but not the war. If America were allowed time to rebuild, Japan's early triumphs would collapse under a tide of production and men. Yamamoto needed a decisive battle, one so crushing it would force Washington to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. That decisive battle would be fought at a place almost no one had heard of, a coral atoll midway between Hawaii and Japan. Midway. Midway was tiny, just 2 main islands shaped like a ring in the endless blue. It was barely large enough for an airstrip and a handful of bunkers, but strategically, it was priceless, a forward base guarding the approaches to Hawaii. Capturing it would draw out America's remaining carriers, Yamamoto reasoned. Once those ships were destroyed, the Pacific would belong to Japan. The plan was bold, almost elegant in its design. On June 4, 1942, a massive Japanese task force, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers and destroyers, would strike Midway with overwhelming power. As American ships rushed to defend it, a hidden second fleet under Yamamoto himself would crush them in ambush. It was the kind of operation that had defined Japanese naval thinking for decades: lure, encircle, annihilate. But there was one flaw the enemy already knew. Thousands of miles away, in a dark basement at Pearl Harbor, known as Station HYPO, American cryptanalysts worked day and night to decode Japan's naval communications. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was a quiet man with a sharp mind and a disregard for convention. For months, his team had been piecing together fragments of code, scattered radio signals, repeated weather reports, and cryptic logistics requests. By late May, they were certain that Japan's next target was AF. The higher command in Washington was skeptical, so Rochefort proposed a test. The Midway base was instructed to send an unencrypted message reporting that its freshwater system had broken down. Within hours, Japanese intelligence transmitted that AF was short of water. Rochefort had his proof. AF was Midway. The implications were staggering. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States knew where and when Japan would strike. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now faced a decision that could decide the fate of the entire war. His fleet was outnumbered. His carrier force, battered at Coral Sea just weeks earlier, was still being repaired. The carrier Yorktown had been hit badly, her flight deck smashed, her hangars torn open, but shipyard crews worked around the clock, rebuilding her in just 72 hours. Nimitz gambled everything. He ordered 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched-up Yorktown, to sail north of Midway, ready to ambush the ambushers. It was a breathtaking risk. If Rochefort was wrong, if the Japanese changed their plans, Nimitz would be exposing his last carriers to destruction. But the admiral trusted the intelligence and the instincts of his men. In late May 1942, the American task force steamed out of Pearl Harbor. The decks were lined with young pilots, many barely out of training. Few of them knew what awaited them. They were heading into the largest carrier battle the world had ever seen. In the first days of June 1942, the Pacific seemed deceptively calm. 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii, clouds drifted lazily above a vast armada of steel, Japan's first mobile force, the Kido Butai. Commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, it was the most powerful striking force ever assembled on the ocean. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed its heart. Each carried seasoned pilots, men who had struck at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier and at Ceylon only weeks before. Their Zero fighters ruled the sky. Their bombers and torpedo planes had brought entire fleets to ruin. Confidence ran high. The Imperial Navy had never lost a carrier battle. Behind them stretched Yamamoto's main body, battleships, cruisers, and transports intended to occupy Midway once it was neutralized. The Japanese operation was massive, complex, and built upon perfect timing. But perfection was fragile. To the south and east, 3 American carriers moved quietly across the Pacific under radio silence. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Enterprise and Hornet, replacing the ill William Bull Halsey, who had fallen sick with a severe skin condition. Spruance was a cruiser officer, not a carrier man, but he was calm, methodical, and guided by Halsey's sharp instincts. To the north, the Yorktown, under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, limped into position after emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor. Her crew called her the Ghost Ship, patched and painted, but ready to fight. Nimitz had positioned them northeast of Midway, a hidden crescent waiting in the enemy's path. He only had 3 carriers against Japan's 4, yet he possessed what Yamamoto did not: knowledge. The Americans knew the Japanese timetable, their approach vector, even their call signs. For once, it was Japan sailing into an ambush. On June 3, at dawn, a U.S. Catalina flying boat spotted part of the Japanese invasion group. The alarm went out. At Midway, Marines and Navy personnel braced for battle. Bunkers were dug, guns loaded, airstrips repaired through the night. The garrison on the atoll numbered barely 1,200 men. They knew what was coming, and that they might not survive it. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, the Japanese launched their first strike. 108 aircraft rose from the carriers in tight formation, glinting orange in the morning sun. Their target? The island of Midway itself. Within an hour, bombs began falling. Hangars and fuel tanks erupted in flame. Runways were cratered. Smoke curled thousands of feet into the sky. But Midway's defenders fought back.
Marine pilots in F-2A Buffaloes and F-4 Wildcats scrambled to meet the attack. Many were shot down almost immediately. Their aircraft were outdated, slower, and outgunned. Yet, their desperate defense forced Nagumo to make a decision that would change everything. Reports came in that Midway was still operational. A second strike might be needed. But even as Nagumo debated, his scout planes reported sighting American ships to the northeast. The admiral was caught between two imperatives: finish off Midway or prepare for a carrier battle. He chose hesitation. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered the planes returning from Midway to be recovered, refueled, and rearmed, switching their ordnance from land bombs to torpedoes for a potential naval engagement. His decks became scenes of frantic chaos. Bombs rolled aside, torpedoes lifted into place, fuel hoses snaking across the wooden planks. The air reeked of gasoline and sweat. It was the moment his fleet was most vulnerable. Aircraft crowded, decks open, hangars filled with explosives. Meanwhile, far beyond the horizon, Spruance and Fletcher had already launched their own strikes. The skies above the Pacific filled with American planes, torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, dive bombers struggling to locate the enemy, and scout planes spreading in wide arcs. But the ocean is vast. Communication was patchy. The first American attacks went disastrously wrong. Torpedo squadrons flew headlong into swarms of Zero fighters, their slow, lumbering aircraft cut apart before reaching range. Dozens of young aviators were shot down in flames, crashing into the sea without a single hit. Their sacrifice, however, had a consequence no one could have planned. As the Japanese fighters swooped down to chase the low-flying torpedo planes, the skies above 15,000 feet were suddenly clear. It was a gap, invisible but decisive, through which another group of Americans would soon arrive. Above the Pacific, 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown were closing in, guided not by radar or radio, but by intuition and luck. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had been searching fruitlessly for hours. Fuel was running low. Then, in the distance, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Archie, racing north at full speed. He followed. The destroyer was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after chasing an American submarine. Its course led straight to Nagumo's carriers. At 10:20 a.m., McCluskey's formation broke through the clouds and sighted the Japanese armada. The decks of Akagi and Kaga shimmered in the sunlight, packed with planes, fuel, and bombs. In less than 10 minutes, the sky would descend upon them.
The human angle. War is often measured in tonnage, strategy, or firepower. But on that morning over Midway, it was measured in human nerves. For the Japanese, those decks represented years of training and discipline. Pilots of the WW2 were among the most skilled aviators on Earth. They had grown up in a culture of obedience, precision, and fatalistic courage. To them, duty to the Emperor was absolute. As the sun rose on June 4, many believed they were striking the final blow that would secure Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Below deck, mechanics labored in the suffocating heat of the hangars. Their movements were rehearsed, efficient, almost ritualistic. Ordnance rolled along narrow rails. Aircraft refueled with exact timing. Torpedoes aligned in gleaming rows. Yet even perfection has limits under pressure. Every delay, every rearming order pushed the crews further into confusion and fatigue. On the American side, the pilots were young, painfully young.
The men of the U.S. Navy's aircraft groups averaged barely 22 years old. Many had never seen combat before Midway. They had learned to fly on the windswept plains of Kansas or the humid coasts of Florida. Now they faced the most feared air arm in the world. Inside the cramped cockpits of SPD Dauntless dive bombers and TBD Devastator torpedo planes, their flight suits were soaked with sweat. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, empty and silent. The hum of engines and the smell of oil were their only companions. Each man knew the odds. Few expected to return. When the first waves of torpedo squadrons went in, their courage bordered on hopeless defiance. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, attacked without fighter cover. Every single aircraft was shot down. None scored a hit. Of the 30 airmen, only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating for hours amid burning wreckage, watching the battle unfold around him. Their deaths bought time and distraction, and cleared the way for the strike that would change history. Above them, another group of Americans, guided by luck and persistence, was closing in. Their leader, Wade McCluskey, was calm, professional, almost detached. His men had been searching for hours, low on fuel, their nerves frayed. Yet when they spotted the enemy, fatigue vanished, replaced with grim focus. For these pilots, war was no longer an abstract map or a distant strategy. It was the gleam of sunlight on a carrier deck, the shape of anti-aircraft bursts rising toward them, the seconds ticking as they dove from 20,000 feet toward certain death. They were about to write their names into history, not as men who won a battle, but as those who flew into the very heart of it. The technological angle. Midway was not only a test of courage, it was a clash of technology, an invisible race between innovation and tradition. In 1942, the aircraft carrier was still a relatively new instrument of war. Before Pearl Harbor, battleships had dominated naval doctrine. The idea that flat-decked vessels, each carrying less armor than a cruiser, could decide the fate of nations was still controversial. Midway would erase any doubt. The Japanese carriers represented the peak of pre-war naval engineering. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were unmatched in agility and range. The Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo planes that filled their decks were proven deadly machines. Japan's pilots trained with an intensity few nations could match. Hundreds of carrier landings, countless flight hours. The Americans, by contrast, were learning on the job. Their aircraft were slower, heavier, often less maneuverable. The TBD Devastator torpedo plane was practically obsolete, underpowered, poorly armored, and slow. Yet the Americans compensated with something the Japanese lacked: coordination between ships, intelligence from code breaking, and a growing mastery of radar. Radar, still primitive by modern standards, had become a silent guardian. On Midway Island, radar operators picked up approaching aircraft at long range, giving defenders precious minutes to launch aircraft. On U.S. carriers, it provided early warning, tracking the movement of incoming raids across the vast ocean. Though crude and often unreliable, it signaled the dawn of a new era in naval warfare, the age of information. Radio, too, played a defining role. The Japanese maintained tight radio discipline, an advantage in secrecy, but a handicap in flexibility. The Americans, by contrast, relayed messages rapidly, coordinating air groups over enormous distances. It was a fragile lifeline. Static, weather, and the chaos of combat often garbled transmissions. Yet without it, the dauntless squadrons that found Nagumo's fleet would have remained lost over empty sea. Even the weapons themselves told a story of contrast. The Americans' 1,000-pound bombs, when dropped from near vertical dives, could punch through carrier decks and ignite fuel stores below. Japanese anti-aircraft guns, though deadly, were optimized for horizontal bombers, not for aircraft plummeting from the sky at 275 miles per hour. Technology had given both sides wings, but it was how they used them that mattered. The Japanese operated with precision and pride, honed by experience, but rigid in doctrine. The Americans improvised, adapted, learned from disaster. Midway would prove that in war, flexibility often outweighs perfection. As engines roared over the Pacific that morning, two worlds collided. One born of discipline and faith in tradition, and the other of innovation and hard lessons learned through loss. And in that collision, the future of naval warfare was being written.
The leadership angle. In war, decisions made in minutes can decide the fate of nations. Midway was a showcase of command under pressure and the cost of hesitation. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Japan's Pacific strategy, was a complex man. A former naval attaché to Washington, he understood America better than most of his peers. He had warned Japan's leaders that war with the United States could not be won in a long struggle. For 6 months to a year, he had said, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, I can promise nothing. Midway fell exactly at the end of that prediction. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was elaborate, even brilliant, but fatally overcomplicated. His forces were divided into multiple task groups spread across thousands of miles. He intended to use deception, to attack the Aleutians as a diversion, and to lure the American carriers into his main fleet's trap. Yet in dispersing his strength, he violated a fundamental principle of naval warfare: concentration of force. Commanding the strike force at Midway itself was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. A cautious officer by temperament, Nagumo was no stranger to command, but lacked experience with carrier warfare. His background was in torpedo tactics, not air operations. At Pearl Harbor, his subordinates had executed a perfect surprise. At Midway, surprise belonged to the enemy. Nagumo's critical moment came just after 7 a.m. on June 4, when reports arrived of both the need for a second strike on Midway and the possible presence of American ships. His dilemma was genuine, but his response, to wait for confirmation before committing, proved catastrophic. Every minute spent refueling and rearming his planes left his carriers exposed. On the American side, leadership took a different form. Admiral Nimitz commanded not from the sea, but from Pearl Harbor, trusting his subordinates to act independently. His confidence in intelligence, his willingness to gamble with limited forces, and his calm composure under uncertainty became hallmarks of American command philosophy. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise were contrasting personalities. Fletcher seasoned but cautious, Spruance analytical and direct. Together, they embodied Nimitz's belief that leadership was not about perfection, but adaptability. When orders failed or plans faltered, they improvised, and that flexibility became their greatest weapon. In the end, Midway was not only a battle of ships and planes, it was a contest of command, between those who clung to control and those who trusted their men to act. The tactical angle. Tactics at Midway unfolded like a chess game played blindfolded across an ocean. Each side moved without seeing the other clearly, guided only by fragments of information. Japan's tactical doctrine had been forged through years of success. Its carrier strike groups operated with precision, launching waves of coordinated attacks that overwhelmed opponents. But that doctrine relied on initiative gained through surprise, something they no longer possessed.
The Americans, aware of Japanese intentions through codebreaking, inverted the logic of ambush. Nimitz deliberately placed his carriers northeast of Midway, the one direction the Japanese did not expect opposition. By holding his carriers in reserve, he allowed the Japanese to commit fully to their Midway strike before counterattacking. The morning's air battles were a study of sacrifice and sequence. The doomed torpedo squadrons, VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3, attacked first, drawing Japanese fighters to low altitude. Those engagements were slaughter. Dozens of devastators were torn apart before releasing a single torpedo. Yet this suicidal persistence achieved the very opening that changed the outcome. When Wade McCluskey and Richard Best led the dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown onto the Japanese fleet around 10:20 a.m., the sky above the carriers was virtually unguarded. The Japanese combat air patrols, low and scattered, could not climb back in time. Anti-aircraft guns swung upward too late. Tactically, it was the perfect storm of circumstance. American persistence intersecting Japanese vulnerability. The dauntless bombers, diving almost vertically from high altitude, exploited that fleeting window. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. Midway demonstrated how tactics in modern warfare hinged not merely on numbers, but on timing, on exploiting the smallest mistake, the briefest hesitation. The Japanese had the stronger force, better trained crews, and more experience, but their flawless system failed when the unexpected disrupted it. The moral angle. Behind the tactics and machinery lay a deeper truth, the moral strain of men confronting the limits of duty, faith, and survival. For Japan's naval aviators, the code of Bushido infused everything. Failure was dishonor, retreat unthinkable. Pilots who crashed into the sea often chose not to escape their cockpits. Officers went down with their ships. It was loyalty expressed through death, an ideal as beautiful as it was tragic. At Akagi's bridge, Captain Taijiro Aoki stood in disbelief as fire consumed the flight deck. The ship that had led Pearl Harbor's triumph was now a burning ruin. Sailors fought desperately to contain the flames, but aviation fuel turned the hangars into furnaces. When Admiral Nagumo abandoned ship, Aoki stayed behind. That night he ordered the scuttling of his vessel and remained aboard as it slipped beneath the waves. The Americans carried their own burden. The pilots who survived the dive attacks returned to find their squadrons decimated. Many of them had lost friends they had trained with since flight school. The elation of victory mingled with grief. Men like Richard Best, who delivered the fatal blow to Akagi, would spend years haunted by the faces of those who didn't return. Midway, for all its heroism, revealed the brutal arithmetic of modern war, how courage could coexist with annihilation, and how victory often demanded sacrifice beyond measure. In those 5 minutes of destruction, 307 Japanese airmen perished, and Japan's elite naval aviation, the pride of an empire, began to vanish into the sea. Yet even as flames engulfed the horizon, the battle was not over. One carrier remained, Hiryu, and she was about to strike back.
The clock struck 10:20 a.m. Above the calm Pacific, 3 formations of SBD Dauntless dive bombers descended through scattered clouds. Their engines droned like distant thunder. Below them stretched the Japanese carrier force. 4 giants of steel and timber spread across the ocean, glinting in the sun. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the dive group from Enterprise. He had been searching for hours, burning precious fuel, guided only by instinct and the telltale wake of the destroyer Arashi. Now, at last, The enemy lay before him, unaware, unprepared, and exposed. The scene below was a picture of lethal order on the edge of chaos. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were recovering aircraft from their first strike on Midway. Flight decks were crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. Torpedoes gleamed in the sunlight. Rows of bombs lay waiting to be loaded. Gasoline hoses snaked across the decks like veins, carrying the volatile lifeblood of the fleet. It was a tableau of strength and vulnerability. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. Attack. At 10:22 a.m., the first Dauntlesses rolled over into near-vertical dives. The world became a blur of wind, steel, and gravity. The roar of engines rose into a scream as the bombers plummeted at over 250 miles per hour. Pilots clenched the dive brakes, sighted their targets through the glare, and held steady as anti-aircraft bursts bloomed around them. The first group aimed for Kaga. Her flight deck filled the sight picture of every bomber. Japanese gunners opened fire, tracers streaking through the air, but they were too late. The first bomb struck just aft of the bridge, then another, then another. 3 1,000-pound bombs ripped through the wooden deck, detonating in the hangar spaces below. Flames erupted instantly, fed by open fuel lines and stacked ordnance. The explosions tore through aircraft, ignited gasoline vapors, and turned Kaga into a single, roaring inferno. Within minutes, her decks buckled, engulfed in orange flame. Just a few thousand yards away, Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was struck next. Lieutenant Richard Best of Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 6, with only 3 aircraft remaining in formation, peeled off toward her. Best's bomb struck directly at the forward elevator shaft, penetrating the hangar deck before detonating among fueled and armed planes. The blast was catastrophic. Fire raced through the lower decks, consuming everything in its path. Akagi's crew fought desperately to contain the flames, but the inferno was uncontrollable. Ammunition cooked off in chain detonations. The bridge filled with smoke. Nagumo stood frozen, watching the ship that had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor become a blazing wreck. To the north, Soryu was hit almost simultaneously by dive bombers from Yorktown. 3 direct hits tore through her decks, setting off secondary explosions that shattered the carrier's structure. Aircraft, munitions, and men were hurled into the air. Within 20 minutes, she too was mortally aflame. From horizon to horizon, the sea turned into a panorama of smoke and destruction. The Japanese formation, moments before a symbol of precision and discipline, was now a scene of chaos. Destroyers raced alongside the carriers, spraying water onto burning hulls, rescuing survivors from the oil-slicked water. Pilots returning from Midway found nowhere to land. They circled helplessly until their fuel ran out, then ditched into the sea. In the space of 5 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:27, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were fatally struck. Over 70 aircraft, hundreds of sailors, and Japan's air superiority in the Pacific vanished in a heartbeat. For the Americans above, disbelief mixed with exhilaration. Radio calls erupted. "They're burning! They're all burning!" The pilots of the dauntless squadrons, exhausted, half out of fuel, pulled away from the inferno. Below them, columns of black smoke rose 20,000 feet into the air, marking the graves of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Yet even amid victory, there was confusion. Reports were fragmented. No one knew if more enemy carriers remained. The sea was still dangerous, and the surviving Japanese force, led by Hiryu, was already preparing to strike back. For Admiral Nagumo, the moment was a nightmare made real. His command ship crippled, his air groups annihilated. He transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagura. His messages to Yamamoto were terse, stripped of emotion.
3 carriers heavily damaged, situation critical. But for Japan's fleet commanders, the truth was worse than critical. It was irreversible. Still, the battle was not over. One carrier, Hiryu, stood intact to the north. Her flight deck was clear, her pilots ready, her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, determined to fight to the last. At 10:30 a.m., as the flames consumed the heart of Japan's carrier force, Hiryu turned into the wind and began launching her counterstrike.
Smoke still curled into the sky from the burning hulks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu when Hiryu, the lone surviving Japanese carrier, prepared her counterattack. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, a proud, resolute officer, refused to concede defeat. To him, honor demanded retaliation, no matter the odds. His aircrews, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, understood what was at stake. They moved with silent urgency, loading torpedoes, checking controls, eyes stung by smoke drifting across the deck. At 10:45 a.m., Hiryu launched her first strike. 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. The target, the American carrier group, now somewhere to the northeast. The Japanese pilots found Yorktown just after noon. The sea was calm, the sky clear. On Yorktown's deck, lookouts spotted the glint of enemy aircraft approaching from the southwest. The alarm bell sounded, enemy planes inbound. Within seconds, the carrier's crew sprang into practiced motion. Guns were manned, hoses readied, damage control teams took position. The first wave dove in. Bombs exploded along Yorktown's flight deck. One hit near the island superstructure, another struck near the forward elevator, blowing open the hangar deck. Flames burst skyward, black smoke rolled over the ship. Yet the damage control crews fought with speed and precision. Fires were contained, steering restored. Within an hour, Yorktown was back under control, her crew working in an eerie calm amid the stench of fuel and scorched metal. Yamaguchi believed he had sunk an American carrier. The smoke rising on the horizon seemed proof enough. Confident, he prepared a second strike. At 1:30 p.m., Hiryu launched 14 torpedo bombers. Once again, their target was Yorktown, still afloat, her decks now patched and ready to recover aircraft. The American radar picked up the incoming planes, and fighter cover moved to intercept. The sky turned into a swirling melee of tracers and vapor trails. Despite heavy resistance, several Japanese torpedo planes broke through. They attacked in a classic pincer formation, 2 groups approaching from port and starboard. The crew of Yorktown watched helplessly as the white wakes of torpedoes streaked toward the ship. At 2:42 p.m., 2 torpedoes struck home. The impact lifted the massive carrier out of the water. Bulkheads crumpled, power failed, and the ship began to list to port. Within minutes, the order was given to abandon ship. Sailors climbed down ropes and ladders into the sea, clinging to rafts and floating debris. For the second time that day, it seemed Japan had evened the score. But the fog of war deceived both sides. The Americans still had 2 undamaged carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, ready to strike again. And Hiryu's position had now been revealed. At 3:30 p.m., scout planes from Enterprise spotted the Japanese carrier steaming alone amid a thin haze of smoke. The order was given immediately: launch everything available. At 4:15 p.m., 30 dive bombers lifted from Enterprise's deck, flying low over the waves toward the target. Among them were pilots who had already flown one sortie that morning, exhausted men with just enough fuel for a single decisive attack. The afternoon light was golden, the sea calm again, deceptively peaceful. Then, as the Dauntlesses climbed into attack position, the horizon opened, and Hiryu came into view. Her deck was lined with armed aircraft preparing for a third strike. The Americans rolled into their dives.
Bombs fell like iron rain. The first struck near the island, tearing through the flight deck. The second penetrated the hangar, detonating among fueled aircraft. The third ignited the forward section. Within seconds, Hiryu was engulfed in fire. Flames leapt hundreds of feet into the air, black smoke boiling skyward. Below decks, sailors fought to contain the inferno, but the ship was doomed. Yamaguchi, refusing to abandon his command, stood on the bridge watching the flames climb higher. He ordered his remaining crew to evacuate. Many begged him to leave with them. He shook his head. "It is enough. I will stay with my men." As evening fell over the Pacific, Hiryu burned fiercely, her ammunition stores detonating in a chain of explosions visible for miles. By midnight, she was dead in the water. At dawn, the order came to scuttle her. She slipped beneath the sea, taking Yamaguchi and hundreds of sailors with her. When the sun rose on June 5, 1942, the balance of the Pacific War had changed forever. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, the very core of the Kido-butai, were gone. The air crews that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor were lost with them. Only a handful of survivors were rescued. The Imperial Navy's ability to project air power across the ocean had been crippled in a single day. On the American side, Yorktown still floated, battered but defiant. Tugs moved to tow her home. She would not make it. A Japanese submarine would later find her and finish the job, but her sacrifice had already bought history. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had not merely been stopped, but beaten. The 5 minutes that morning had decided the course of an entire conflict and changed the destiny of empires. When dawn rose on June 5, 1942, the sea that had shimmered like glass the day before was littered with the wreckage of Japan's shattered dream. The fires on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu still burned through the night, their smoke drifting low across the waves. Rescue destroyers circled the ruins, plucking half-dead survivors from oil-slicked water. The stench of fuel and scorched flesh hung heavy in the air. For many Japanese sailors, there was no rescue, only silence beneath the surface, where thousands of tons of steel and human stories sank together into the dark. On Akagi's bridge, Captain Taijiro Aoki stood amid twisted metal and smoldering debris, his ship listing and ablaze. When it became clear the carrier could not be saved, he gave the order to scuttle. At 10 p.m., destroyers fired torpedoes into the glowing hulk, sending the pride of Japan's carrier fleet to the bottom. Aoki remained aboard until the end. His body was never found. Similar scenes unfolded across the shattered fleet. Kaga's fires raged unchecked until her magazine exploded, blowing the ship apart. Soryu was abandoned after internal explosions made further rescue impossible. Hiryu, which had fought so fiercely into the afternoon, lingered until early morning, her decks still burning. Her crew gathered on the listing deck to sing the Japanese naval anthem before she slipped beneath the waves at dawn on June 5th. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, the same ships that had struck at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Along with them went over 300 aircraft, nearly 3,000 officers and men, and most critically, Japan's irreplaceable cadre of veteran pilots and flight deck crews. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato, far to the rear, received the reports with stunned disbelief. His carefully woven plan, designed to annihilate the U.S. fleet, had instead destroyed the heart of his own. For hours, he paced the deck in silence, refusing to accept the scale of the defeat. When he finally ordered a general withdrawal, his message was brief and bitter. Cease operations. Return to base. The retreat was orderly, but heavy with despair. Japanese ships turned eastward under cover of darkness, their searchlights extinguished, their radios silent. The once invincible Kido-butai, symbol of Japanese dominance, no longer existed. On the American side, the mood was mixed. Relief,
exhaustion, disbelief. At Midway Atoll, the small garrison that had endured hours of bombing looked out across the sea to see the wreckage burning on the horizon. Many did not yet know what had happened, only that the enemy's attacks had ceased. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the first reports with characteristic calm. His staff watched as he studied the messages in silence, then allowed himself a faint smile. "It looks," he said quietly, "like we've got them." The cost, however, was not light. The carrier Yorktown, which had absorbed 2 separate attacks, lay crippled and dead in the water. Over the next 2 days, American crews worked desperately to save her. The carrier was taken in tow by the destroyer Haman, pumps running, fires out. It seemed she might yet make it home. But on June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped through the protective screen. Launching a spread of torpedoes, it struck both Haman and Yorktown. The destroyer sank in minutes. Yorktown rolled slowly to port. Her surviving crew abandoned ship once more, watching silently as she listed further, her island still standing proud against the dawn. At 7 a.m. on June 7th, the Yorktown capsized and sank beneath the waves, her flag still flying. Though America mourned her loss, the strategic picture had changed beyond measure. The Japanese Navy, which had sought to eliminate America's carrier strength, had instead destroyed the heart of its own. The balance of the Pacific had shifted, not in months, but in a single day. And in the stillness that followed, both sides began to grasp the magnitude of what had happened.
In Tokyo, the truth arrived in fragments. Cautious reports, partial signals, phrases deliberately softened to dull the blow. But there was no way to disguise the enormity of the loss. The Japanese government announced a strategic withdrawal from Midway. The press was forbidden to print the names of the carriers lost, but within naval circles, the truth spread rapidly. Officers who had trained together for years now spoke in hushed tones about vanished ships: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Entire air groups, the best in the empire, gone. The blow was not just material, it was psychological. For 6 months, Japan had known nothing but victory. The myth of invincibility, so carefully cultivated by Tokyo and believed by its people, was broken in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, who had long warned that Japan's window of dominance would be brief, understood what the loss meant. "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." Now, almost to the day, his prophecy had come true. At a meeting aboard the battleship Yamato, Yamamoto's face remained impassive as the reports were read aloud. Around him, officers sat in silence. When the meeting ended, he retired to his cabin, poured a glass of sake, and said quietly to his aide, "The tide has turned." For Japan, Midway was not just a defeat, it was the beginning of a long, irreversible decline. The carriers could be replaced on paper, but Japan lacked the resources and industrial capacity to rebuild them quickly. More devastating still was the loss of her elite air crews, men whose experience could not be trained into new recruits overnight. The Imperial Navy's carrier doctrine, built on precision and coordination, relied on these veterans. Their absence hollowed the fleet from within. In contrast, the United States, stunned but resolute, began to surge. Within months, new Essex-class carriers were sliding off American shipyard slips. Aircraft production soared. Pilots trained in modern tactics were rotated into combat faster than Japan could shoot them down. The industrial balance that Yamamoto had feared now became reality. Midway had done more than destroy ships. It had shattered Japan's strategic initiative. No longer could Tokyo dictate the tempo of the war. The Pacific, once Japan's domain, was now contested and soon would become a battlefield of American advance.
Back at Pearl Harbor, the victory was met not with celebration, but with solemn recognition. Admiral Nimitz ordered a brief ceremony for the fallen. On the deck of the carrier Enterprise, sailors gathered in silence as a chaplain spoke over the ocean that had claimed so many. The words were simple. For those who gave their lives here, the sea will keep its peace. The numbers were staggering. Japan had lost over 3,000 men. The United States, 307. But the weight of the battle could not be measured in numbers alone. Strategically, Midway halted Japan's expansion. Tactically, it marked the first major carrier defeat in history. Symbolically, it reversed the momentum of the entire Pacific War. For the first time, Japan was forced onto the defensive, and for the United States, Midway became proof that the tide could indeed be turned, that courage, intelligence, and luck could overcome even the most formidable enemy. Months later, as American troops prepared for the long island-hopping campaigns that would carry them toward Japan, they remembered the lessons of Midway, that information could be as powerful as firepower, and that sometimes 5 minutes could decide the fate of nations. The coral atoll that had seemed so insignificant became one of the most hallowed names in naval history. The Pacific was far from won, but after June 22, 1942, it was no longer lost. And in the still waters north of Midway, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu rested silently, the steel tombs of an empire's shattered ambition. In war, there are moments that seem to hang outside of time, brief, almost accidental, yet vast in consequence. Midway was one of them. 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, reshaped the balance of the Pacific, and with it, the destiny of the Second World War. For Japan, it was the breaking of a dream, the sudden realization that courage and discipline could not overcome the limits of industry or the weight of numbers. The men who had once believed themselves untouchable now faced the slow, grinding war they had hoped to avoid. For the United States, it was a rebirth. 6 months earlier, the nation had awakened to the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, its pride wounded and its fleet burning. Midway restored not just ships or territory, but faith. It proved that planning, intelligence, and sacrifice could rewrite the course of a war once thought lost. Yet, beneath the strategy and the statistics, Midway remained profoundly human. Young pilots, many barely 20, flew into skies filled with fire, knowing the odds were against them. Sailors on both sides fought to save burning ships or went down with them, bound by duty and belief. In the end, the battle was not just a contest of fleets. It was a testament to endurance, to the ability of men to face annihilation with purpose. History often remembers Midway for its luck, for the timing, the coincidences, the 5 fateful minutes. But luck alone does not build victory. The cryptanalysts who broke the code, the officers who trusted their intelligence, the airmen who dived through smoke and gunfire, they made those 5 minutes possible. Today the names Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet rest silent beneath the waves, symbols of sacrifice and turning tides. The sea has reclaimed them, as it does all things. But the echo of Midway endures, a reminder that even in the vastness of war, a single hour, a single decision, a single moment of courage can alter the fate of the world.